Excellent. Okay, so Unit 5 deals with cognitive psychology. Y'all may remember that Unit 4 with learning was very, very heavy on behaviorism, like Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner and Edward Thorndike, where it was like, hey, we should only measure what we can observe, like how much saliva a dog has in response to a tuning fork. Right? With cognitive psychology, they say, no, you can't explain everything with just behavior. There are some invisible cognitive processes that occur, like with latent learning, where you learn something, but you don't know that they've learned it because you've not tested them on it, like with the rats in the maze, right? And then once you provide an incentive, that's when they show what they've learned. Okay, so the cognitive psychology deals not only with learning, but also with how our memory works, with the things that we can't always necessarily objectively measure. Okay, and all memory is learning that has continued over time. Okay, so you have short-term memory and you have long-term memory. Okay, hopefully most of this class has been moved into your long-term memory, right? Because you've repeated and encoded all of that information. You're like, yeah, bet. It's like, I don't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning. So learning that has continued over time. And within this unit, we're going to talk about a bunch of different types of learning. Okay, memory. We're going to talk about explicit memory, and no, it's not bad. Okay, explicit just means like episodic or semantic. Episodic means like memories in your life. Do you remember your first day at school this year? Do you remember your first day in kindergarten? That's episodic because it is episodes of your life. Semantic memory is explicit, with semantic just being meaning. Okay, does it have a meaning to it? Okay, that's explicit. Implicit is automatic. Okay, automatic memory, like muscle memory is a common example. If you've ever learned how to ride a bike, even years later, or roller skate, even years later, if you haven't touched a bike in years and you get on it, you're very quickly going to remember how to ride that bike because it's in your muscle memory. You don't always have to think about it. We're also going to talk about recall and recognition. Recall is the more difficult task in memory. Recall is like if I give y'all an essay exam or a free response question. If I ask you to apply classical conditioning to a scenario, then you have to be able to remember what is classical conditioning, what is the unconditioned stimulus, what is the unconditioned response, what's the neutral stimulus, all of that. You don't have a word bank to the side, you don't have a cheat sheet or a study guide. It's all straight from your head, right? Whereas recognition is more multiple choice tests or an ID quiz. If I give you a quiz and I give you a word bank, all you've got to be able to do is recognize what is the right answer. Okay, so recognition is like straight up memorization. We're able to just recognize the correct answer, like with most multiple choice. And recall is more difficult. That's more free response questions or essays, okay, where it's not in front of you, you have to actually pull it out of your brain. We're also going to study the loss of memory or amnesia and whether it's anterograde or retrograde, meaning do you lose the ability to form new memories? Do you lose the ability to remember old memories? Is it your long-term memory that's affected, your short-term memory that's affected? That all deals with amnesia. And then the first part of the unit that we're going to spend a lot of time covering are the two models of memory. Okay, so it's not uncommon for us to have multiple models for different units. Like with Psych, you have the trichromatic theory of color and the opponent process theory of color. Which one's right? Both of them. We use both of them to explain how we see. With hearing, you have place theory and frequency theory. What part of the basilar membrane in your cochlea helps you hear? Both of those theories, right? With memory, you have the information processing model and you have the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, also known as the multimodal theory. Okay, each of these models contain three parts. With the information processing model, this explains how we store things in memory through first encoding it, then storing it, and then retrieving it or remembering it, right? Encoding is just you paying attention to a stimulus. Okay, so you can say, hey, I want to remember that. That's encoding, you're paying attention. If you're successful at encoding it, then you can store it. Okay, it could be stored in your working memory, your short-term memory, or your long-term memory. If you repeat it enough times from your short-term memory, then eventually it moves into your long-term memory, which is potentially limitless. There are some people that we're going to talk about that have an eidetic memory, meaning that they remember everything. Everything they've ever read, everything they've ever said, everything that they've ever heard, which sounds like a nightmare to me because I already have difficulty falling asleep at night because I'm like, oh man, remember that time in 4th grade when you did that super embarrassing thing? Like, remember if that was with everything, I would just be like, no, I'm staying inside. Then with retrieval, if you want to remember something like, oh, where did I put my keys? Or did I turn in that ID assignment? That is retrieval. Okay, so those are the 3 steps in the information processing model: encoding, storage, retrieval. With the multimodal theory of Atkinson and Shiffrin, instead of them talking about the steps of memory, they talk about the different types of memory. First type is sensory, very, very brief, tenths of a second. Okay, visual memory and auditory memory, iconic and echoic. Short-term memory, okay, chunks of information, 5 to 9 pieces of information that you can store for about 30 seconds in your short-term memory, moving into 20 minutes for short-term memory. And then long-term memory, which is potentially limitless, where you could potentially never run out of space if you've rehearsed a piece of information enough times. Okay, so like your phone number might be in long-term memory, or your booze phone number may be in your long-term memory. Y'all don't know any phone numbers anymore because you got contact lists. Back in my day, okay, you actually had to memorize like 5 to 10 different people's numbers because you didn't have cell phones or anything. It was just pay phones, pay phones and landlines. So now y'all probably, I don't even know my mama's number. I just go into my phone. What happens if you lose your contacts? All right, so those are the 2 theories that we're going to be dealing with predominantly, particularly today. We should get to, we should cover the first stage, encoding and sensory memory, before we move into part 2 when we return on Thursday, which would be storage with short-term and long-term. Are we ready? All right, this video is in Schoology. If you want to watch it, we're going to skip it. Instead, we're going to do an activity in the chat privately. Okay, don't show everybody your answers. I want you to recall the names of the 7 dwarves from Snow White. I like that, Morgan. Snexy. I think you misspelled something. It's like, who's the Snexy dwarf? Leppy? Leper? I'm going to share some of the funny ones that I've gotten over the years. I've gotten Daddy, Sleazy, Juicy, Slim Shady, Stinky, and some people would write like depressed one. I'm like, that's not, it's just called the depressed one. Okay, I'm trying to see if anyone's gotten it. I think Elizabeth Albrecht. Chandler, I think you've got 5. Elabeth, you're missing one. It's the hard one. Lexi, you got him. Bria, Dobby. Dobby. I'm going to put Dobby on the list. Dobby is a free elf. Oh, Elabeth, you got the last one. Yep. Yep. And Morgan, or Chandler. I think, yeah, Amy got all 7 of them right too. All right, are we ready to reveal? The answers are Sleepy, Dopey, Doc. That one's always the hard one for me. Grumpy, Bashful, Happy, and Sneezy. So we got a few people that got all 7 of them. I'm going to trust you that you didn't Google them. Now, if you've watched Snow White a lot, which back in my day when we had VHS Disney movies, and that's pretty much all we had, right? I would watch Lion King and Bambi and Snow White. Snow White was, I actually think the first Disney movie, if I remember correctly, that they've ever made, or at least it was like the first in color one, like animated. If you've watched those over and over again, then you've encoded them into your memory. Okay, you've moved them into storage because you've encountered them over and over again. But if you've never watched, okay, yeah, it's the first in color and the first Disney princess. Thank you, Elizabeth. If you've never watched Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, then you're just like, their names could be anything. You may not even know that they end in Y. Like in my last class, 5th period, Terrence was like, yeah, no, I don't know them. Like, it sounds like Mariah Carey whenever she's asked about someone in an interview, she's like, I don't know them. Okay, they're irrelevant. Okay, so if you've never come into contact with them, then you never encoded them, you've never stored them. Although I think we should make a new Snow White just based on the names that y'all have come up with. I think that would be a really funny, I'd watch that. I'd binge watch that on Netflix. Kesha could play the sleazy one because she's got that song. And Eminem, obviously, Slim Shady. Okay, so memory is just learning that has continued over time. Okay, we encode it, then we store it, and then we remember it. Okay, memory is what ties us to our past. It's what gives us an idea of our identity and who we are. Okay, and so the 2 models we're going to look at today are information processing, which remember is 1, encoding, then storage, then 3, retrieval, and the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, or the multimodal or multi-store model of sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So the first model we're looking at, the information processing model. Number 1, you have encoding. Encoding is processing the information in order to put it into storage. Okay, so these are steps. Okay, so first to encode, you're processing everything that you're seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling, okay, so that you pay attention to it. And then once you pay attention to it, that starts the process of moving it into storage, with short-term storage being obviously short-term. So you're maintaining that information for a short period of time, between 30 seconds and 20 minutes. So like if you're trying to remember, for instance, a shopping list, that's not something you need to remember for the rest of your life. Okay, if you're just like, okay, we need bread, cereal, milk. Okay, you may repeat it to yourself on the drive over to the grocery store. Okay, but that's not something that you're going to study with index cards. Okay, so you can pass a test, right? Although most of y'all are probably like, yeah, most of my education is short term. Like after test, bye, like clear cookies. Long-term memory, okay, is for things that you'll need for an extended period of time. Then whenever you need to get that information out of storage, that's called retrieval. This is the process of bringing the memory back into your consciousness. So I want y'all to keep in mind, keep an eye on that word consciousness. None of this is observable, okay, until it gets tested, like with a multiple choice test or an essay, right? But you bringing it into your consciousness. So it's not like everything that you've ever known ever is just sitting there right in your consciousness. Some of it gets stored away until it needs to be brought out later. Okay, are we good so far? So how does this process work? What are the beginnings of memory? Well, to make a memory, first you got to pay attention. Okay, it starts out in your sensory memory, which is just you observing the things in your environment. So, if you want to remember a license plate, for instance, you don't just pay attention to every license plate you see while you're driving, but if someone hits you, right, then you're going to be like, okay, bet. I'm going to look at your license plate and try to remember as much of it as possible. Okay, that's your visual memory. That's iconic. Not iconic in the way that Mariah Carey is iconic, okay, but it's focusing more on the keyword icon. Y'all may remember from AP World History with me, iconoclasm. Okay, that was being against the use of religious icons or religious images. So when you think icon, think image. So visual stimuli. This is visual sensory memory that lasts for a tenth of a second. So very, 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 very brief. Okay, because you're not paying attention to it. If you pay attention to it, then you might be able to put it into your selective attention and thus into storage. So, to encode the information, which is the first step in storing the information, you need to pay attention. Iconic memory is crazy short, very difficult to measure because of how quickly it disappears. Echoic memory, the key word there is echo. So instead of thinking images, you should think sounds. So this is the mental representation of sounds. Now this can last longer than your visual memory. So 3 to 4 seconds. Okay, like if you remember a tune. Okay, or you may remember someone telling you their zip code, so you use the same inflections that they're using in order to remember it while you're writing it down. Okay, but sensory memory is very difficult to measure because of how short it is, with iconic memory being the shorter of the two. But this is the first step in moving it into storage. You need to pay attention in order to remember it, right? Like if I asked you to remember what shirt your friend was wearing when you walked to class, you saw it, you knew you saw it, you knew that they were wearing a shirt, but you weren't paying attention to what color it was in order to remember it later. Are we good? The main point, sensory memories disappear very, very quickly. If you want them to stay, you have to pay attention to the information, like to the license plate or to the phone number. Okay, by paying attention, you're encoding it further. You're further processing it into your storage. Okay, so the first time you pay attention, that's the initial encoding. Okay, it's not as effective. The more you encode, the more you repeat, the more effective it is. So the initial encoding is the process of paying attention to whatever stimulus you're trying to remember. And then your brain starts making those neural connections. Okay, as the information jumps electrochemically from dendrite to axon, from dendrite to axon, that creates the first neural connections. That's why when you're first learning something, it takes longer. Okay, so for instance, if you're learning your multiplication tables as a second grader, like, dude, that's the first time that you came into contact with them, right? You've got subtraction, you've got addition down, but multiplication's new. It might take you a week or two to learn all of your tables. But then by the time you're in high school, if someone asks you 2 by 2, bam, it's there. 11 times 11, bam, it's there. 9 times 9, well, Nathan's like, are you sure? Because I have a calculator for that. So you've already made those neural connections, and so it's much easier for you to relearn material that you may have forgotten. Or say, for instance, in world history. In world history, we spent a lot of time on the Reformation, right? Y'all remember, I'm still Mary Queen of Scots, right? Haunt your dreams. So by the time you get to AP Euro with Mr. Farquhar, you may not remember everything. You may be a little bit fuzzy, but you've got a foundation. So does he spend as much time on the Reformation as I do? Probably not, because you've already learned it. So you can remember it and relearn it much quicker. Okay, same thing with APUSH. I've already talked to you about the Columbian Exchange. Okay, so Mr. Baker doesn't spend a lot of time on the Columbian Exchange and the Native Americans. He moves straight into England and the colonies and the revolution and the Declaration of Independence, all of that good stuff. Okay, moves past the Proclamation of 1763 because he knows we've already covered it. So you've already got neural connections that have been made. So initial encoding are the first neural connections in your brain. And then subsequent encodings are going to be much faster, and that leads to permanent neural connections. But if you don't relearn that material, if you don't refresh and repeat that material, that neural connection can disappear. It can break apart. Okay, so for short-term memory, it can dissipate after 20 minutes if not reused. So you have to repeat the information in order to strengthen the connections between your neurons in order to keep that information in the long term. Okay, so y'all, many kids have always asked me throughout the years, especially my freshmen, how do I study for your class? How do I know all of this information? I've tried note cards. How do I get better at studying? Okay, because it's more than just simple memorization and repetition. So we're going to go over some tips and tricks for how to improve your memory. Okay, so semantic encoding is one of the most effective methods of improving your memory. This gives you the best memory. This is where you encode the information with meaning. So let's say you already have neural connections in your brain. You connect something you already know to something new. So say, for instance, addition. You know that 2 plus 2 is 4. Well, if you already know that, now let's apply that to multiplication. 2 times 2 is 4. Easy peasy. You've already got a neural connection. You just add on to it. You scaffold onto it. That's what semantic encoding is. Okay, so if you're studying for an ID quiz, for instance, prior to the pandemic, before you had a word bank, okay, y'all know from having me freshman year, some of y'all, that when I give you an ID quiz, do I always give you exactly what the definition is in the book or the Quizlet? Nope, I do not, because that's not testing what you know. That's just testing what you can recognize, right? So if I give you a question that says the mutual exchange of goods and ideas and peoples and diseases between the old world and the new world, what is that? I saw Brienne math it, the Columbian exchange. Okay, there were no key words that you memorized word for word from the Quizlet. You just knew based on your previous knowledge, based on the meaning of the words, that I was looking for the term Columbian exchange. So knowing what the terms mean, even if it's worded in different ways, okay, is a better way to learn something semantically as opposed to just memorizing the keywords or the first 2 words in the definition. If you're like, oh yeah, that definition uses the word altruistic. I just need to find that keyword and then match it with the word that I was looking for. That's not as meaningful. That's going to disappear a lot quickly once you brain dump that information out. Okay, so attaching meaning to something makes it more effective. That's part of the reason that I gave y'all meme projects freshman year. Okay, because if you attach it to memes, then you're more likely to remember the information because it's meaningful to you. All right, visual encoding. Sam's just like, ugh, end meeting. Visual encoding is when you pay attention to the iconic image. Okay, so the visual image and creating connections based on that. So like if we're talking about Columbian exchange, you may remember the triangular trade. Here's from Europe to Africa, first leg, from Africa to America, second leg, and from from Americas to Europe with the third leg. You may use that visual in order to help you remember the information, or flow charts or Venn diagrams, okay, to help you recall that information. The least effective type of encoding is acoustic encoding. That's auditory. Okay, echoic. Paying attention to the sounds of words and thus creating those neural connections. So some of y'all may have used songs to remember things like the ABCs or the preamble to the Constitution. And it may help you in the beginning or at the end of the song, but then somewhere in the middle, it gets a little like, okay, I can remember the tune, but I can't remember the words. okay, and then it's useless to you. Okay, so if you're going to rank these in most effective to least effective, semantic is the most effective, attribute meaning to what you're trying to encode. Then visual with like charts and flow charts. And then finally, auditory encoding. Are we good so far? All right, so George Sperling came up with a way to measure iconic memory. And remember, iconic refers to visual sensory memory. Now, how long is that visual sensory memory? Tenths of a second, okay? It is erased like that. So when we look at these letters, we can see all the letters at once. You can see all the way from F all the way to A. You can see all of them at once, but you cannot accurately recall them once they disappear. But even after the letters disappear, you can still see an after image, because remember the opponent process theory. That is called a memory trace. That visual after image, okay, where you have a visual impression of the stimulus, but it only lasts for a fraction of a second. So it's like you're seeing, but also not seeing because of the opponent process theory. So I want y'all to look at these letters. Okay, go ahead and look at them at the screen. Like focus somewhere between the R and the P. Y'all will notice that if you focus here, you can see all of the letters, all 12 of them at one time. Okay, but now if I ask you to recall them very briefly for a split second, okay, you can see the after image and you may say like, oh, there's an R there and a P there, but then it goes away too quickly for you to remember. The saccades in your eyes, the rapid eye movement refreshes that iconic memory. So let's try again. Look at the blue X in the middle. Okay, you're not rehearsing the letters. You're not like, oh, FCHD to try and memorize them. You're just looking at all of them at once. And then next slide. Do you see how quickly that disappears with your memory trace? Okay, that's how George Sperling was able to experiment with how long your sensory memory is. But because your sensory memory is so brief, that's why it was so difficult for him to measure in the first place. But he was able to prove the existence of iconic memory through that experiment by using the opponent process theory with after images. Okay, so you can contain or retain information very briefly in sensory memory. Okay, short-term memory is longer than sensory memory, whereas sensory memory lasts for less than a second. Short-term memory can last for even longer than that. Okay, but there are different methods in order to improve your short-term memory. Okay, so the next example we're going to do. There are 31 numbers. I'm going to give you about half a minute to try and remember as many of these as you can. This is kind of like the Pi Day challenge, right? So try to learn all 31 of those numbers. And we'll see who can get the farthest. All right. Type in the chat. You're accurate up to 9-2. So you're accurate to here. But then you went with 9-1 and it was supposed to be 1-9. Okay, so I think you were the farthest. And then I got, let's see. No, I messed up. No, wait, no, that's right. 19, yep. Okay, so very, very difficult to remember these numbers. And that's because short-term memory, according to George Miller, can only hold so much information. And the rule for that is 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So 7 minus 2 is 5. So you should be able to get around here at the low end of short-term memory, 1, 2, 7, 1, 9. Those of you with really good short-term memory, like Anne, should be able to max out here. All right, sorry, here, because this is 7, to 9 pieces of information. But she was able to go all the way to here. Now, Anne, I think I know how you did this, but do you want to share how you were able to get all the way here? Did you have any special tricks?
I kind of just remember, like, tried focusing on the first line altogether, but then I was like, you know, I have enough time, so I'll just keep going. But then when you took it away, I kind of forgot like the first 5, and I was like, you know what, I would just guess. But yeah, I just kept repeating it.
Okay, so it sounds like what you did was you chunked it. Rather than look at these as individual numbers, as 31 individual numbers, you tried to make it into layers. So you did layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3. Okay, so by chunking it like that, she was able to go much further than anybody else in the chat. Okay, but remember, the most effective way to encode information is to assign meaning to it. Semantics. Are there any meanings, any meaningful information that you can get out of these numbers? Anything that they could represent? Like, say, the first 7 numbers.
You could remember like 1941 is like a year, so like 1941.
Exactly right. So you got 1941, and then what about 12/7? If we're going with the idea of dates. This was a day that would live in infamy.
It's Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, exactly right. The attack on Pearl Harbor. Are there any other dates that we could get out of this list?
I mean, 2001.
Okay, which is that y'all's birth year? Any of y'all?
No.
No. All right, 9/11. What about 1861? What happened in 1861?
Civil War.
The Civil War. What about 1776?
That's not the Declaration, is it?
Mhm.
Oh, it is?
And 1492.
Columbus sailed ocean blue.
Or the Reconquista. 1914.
Is it World War One?
World War I. 1963. Vietnam. Although I've heard some people that they said the civil rights movement, which, yeah, it's in that decade. So, but 1965 is a better year for that. So we could give these meaning. And if we give them meaning, we can encode them semantically. Okay, but the problem with dates is that we tend to prefer them to be in chronological order. So if, I had to memorize the dates, but then I also had to remember what order they came in. So even though I remembered Pearl Harbor, I had to go, okay, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, Civil War, Declaration, Reconquista, World War I, Vietnam. Okay, so that's how I was able to encode all those numbers together. But that wasn't nearly as easy as if I had put them in numerical order and chunk them into 7 dates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, because George Miller said that our short-term memory is made better if we can chunk it into 5 to 9 pieces. 7 minus 2, 7 plus 2. So it's a lot easier to remember these numbers if you think chronological order: Reconquista, Declaration, Civil War, World War I, Pearl Harbor and World War II, Vietnam, 9/11. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to review these 7 chunks, and we'll see how many you can remember with this second round. Okay, so take a moment. All right, ready? All right, in the chat. See if you can get all 7 numbers, 7 chunks. Anne's like, I got this. Step aside. Okay, Sam, you got 4. Ann got all 7. So to Tucker, Nathan's like, it's not 1462, Nathan. You're 3 decades off.
That was a typo.
Oh, that's why I'm going to write on people's essay. Like this entire essay is a typo. Okay, so yeah, a lot more of y'all are getting all 7 or, at least 5 of those numbers. Natalie makes a good point that she remembers them because they all start with number 1. Okay, so that takes some space out of your memory. You're just like, okay, start with a 1 and then continue with the rest of the dates, right? Well, no, 2001 doesn't start with a 1, but it does have a 1 in it. And so instead of memorizing all 31 terms individually, you were able to memorize all 31 terms chunked together. Okay, so for any of you doing the Pi Day competition, okay, you may be able to use that to your advantage by applying semantic meaning to them. So George Miller said that by chunking this, we were able to increase the digit span, okay, of what we could store in our short-term memory. Now, if I ask y'all these dates on Thursday, are you going to be able to remember all of them? Probably not. Nathan's like, no, bet. 1462. Because y'all probably haven't rehearsed them. After today, you're not going to have to ever give that same list of numbers again, potentially. Okay, so that's not something that you're going to rehearse over and over again to keep in your memory. After today, you're going to be like, okay, brain dump, go, like you usually do with every one of your lessons, right? So with semantic encoding, by attributing meaning to what you're trying to learn, there are 2 different types of rehearsal that you can use in order to lengthen that short-term memory. One is elaborate rehearsal. An elaborate rehearsal is when meaning is attributed, okay, versus maintenance rehearsal, where the material is just repeated often. Most people do maintenance rehearsal, just pure memorization. You may know the meaning of 1492, okay, but you have to repeat that date over and over again in order to remember it. Or 1453, the fall of Constantinople, or 1914, World War I. Okay, all of those, that maintenance happens from you repeating the material over and over and over again. Kind of like with your ABCs, you have to repeat them over and over again. Or your multiplication tables, you have to repeat them over and over again. Elaborate rehearsal is more effective, but it takes longer. Okay, that's when you apply the semantics, you apply the meaning in order to use neural connections that you already have. You're just hijacking them for another purpose. Okay, so it's basically like recycling the parts of your brain to use for memory. Okay, so kind of like if you build a memory palace where you're writing an essay. So the entryway to your house is the intro, and the coat rack represents the context information. Okay, all of that using to create a map for you to remember that information. Are we good? Okay. Next, we're going to move into automatic versus effortful encoding. Remember, we're still in the first step of the information processing model. Now, automatic encoding has many different names. These are all synonyms, okay? So don't get tripped up if you get an SAQ and it's like, describe implicit encoding. And you're like, what? We never talked about that. Yes, we did. There's just different names for the same thing. So if it's automatic, non-declarative, meaning you don't have to say anything, or implicit, those are all talking about the same type of encoding, the automatic kind. This is unconscious, so you don't always have to pay attention in order to remember this information. Say, for instance, if I asked, where were you Sunday night? Like, say you're being interrogated for whatever reason. Wait, was that when Mitch McConnell's house was vandalized or Nancy Pelosi's? That was the first. Did y'all see that tweet where Chester Cheeto, the cheetah, was like, it was just an image of Chester the cheetah for the Cheetos ads, the mascot, in a plane. and it says, I'm going to Kentucky for reasons. And that was on January 1st. And everyone was like, ooh, he go beat up Mitch McConnell. And then the very next day, the 2nd of January, that's when they broke the news about Mitch McConnell's house being vandalized, where it says, where's my money? And I'm just like, Chester the cheetah, they're going to be questioning him. Okay. So if for whatever reason, y'all were being questioned for vandalizing members of Congress's house, Nancy Pelosi got hit too. And the police asked you, where were you Sunday night? Okay, well, were you consciously thinking at like 4 p.m., oh, I better remember where I am today? No, you just remember because it was recent. I was like, okay, I was here at school. I didn't have a PD day Monday. So yeah, no, I was here over the weekend. So I was here Sunday from 11 until 5, working on lesson plans and whatever to get ready for the return of their third 9 weeks, right? That's automatic. I knew where I was. I knew the space. I was at LAMP. I knew the time. It was after lunch, but before dinner. And I knew how many times I had come up to the school, twice. Okay, that's automatic. I didn't have to make note cards of where was I on January 3rd, right? It's just implicit. Elizabeth's like, you remember things? Actually, trauma and depression does impact your memory. People who have gone through abusive childhoods often don't have childhood memories. Like there's the infantile amnesia. No one remembers years like 0 to 2, right? Nobody remembers that. And Freud claims that's because of repression, but it's more so just your brain's busy doing other stuff. You can't remember all those things. But if you've been through a traumatic childhood, you may not have memories, before age 9. Okay, it's just because it's just completely gone. And then depression as well affects your ability to remember things as well. So that's a little known fact. Also automatic encoding, well-learned information. Okay, y'all know how to read. So when you read, do you stop and read each individual word and sound it out? No, because you've been doing that since you were 5 or whenever it is that kids start reading. So you can just read the words across a page and you know what they mean. You don't have to stop and think. Okay, that's automatic. Parallel processing. This is also known as dual processing. Now, this is not the same as multitasking. We know that we are not very good at multitasking. If you try to do your homework while watching TV, okay, you're probably going to make some mistakes on your homework, or you're going to miss something going on in Criminal Minds, right? You can either do one or the other well, or you can do both poorly, right? That's different from dual processing or parallel processing. That's the ability for us to take in multiple sensory informations at once. So we can interpret multiple events or multiple stimuli, okay? So like if you play a sport, you're using multiple senses at the same time. You're listening for what your coach is saying. You're seeing the ball coming at you. You're using your kinesthetic sense to move your feet or to dribble the ball or to throw the ball, whatever. Okay, that's parallel processing, not the same as multitasking, right? And we're pretty good at this parallel processing. In fact, even with doing things like reading backwards, we can very quickly pick that up and make it automatic. Okay, so for instance, if I pick up a manga, it'll take me a second because I'll read it the wrong way. I'll be like, oh, start from the front to back. It's like, no, you start from back to front and like read right to left. Okay, so I have to like reorient that. But then after I read a couple of pages, I got it down. I don't have to stop and think, okay, this is where I start on the page, right? So for example, try and read this starting from the right, going right to left, and see if you can figure out what that sentence says. Okay, effortful processing can become automatic. Y'all may have noticed at the beginning, you're like, okay, E-F-F-O-R, Luft, like you're trying to fight against reading it from left to right. But then once you get the hang of it right about here, okay, that's when it becomes second nature. That's when you're able to read it a lot more quickly than you had before. That's an example of parallel processing, okay, where we're able to switch and it becomes automatic. Same thing happens if you wear inversion glasses. If you wear glasses that make the world go upside down, after a few hours, your brain makes the connection and it makes the flip, and you start seeing things normally again, and you can like draw and write and everything without it coming out weird. Okay, so our brain can automatically process that information. Are we good? That's implicit, that's automatic, that's non-declarative because you're not saying anything. Okay, you're just doing automatically. The opposite of that is explicit encoding or declarative or effortful encoding. This is when you remember things and you declare it. You have to have attention and conscious effort. Okay, so if I asked you to go ahead and give a random speech in front of the class, you would have to try and remember something about a topic. Or if I asked you a question, what is classical conditioning, or who was Ivan Pavlov? You'd have to pay attention and consciously bring to mind, okay, Ivan Pavlov was the Russian one with the dogs and he did stuff with spit. And so classical conditioning deals with involuntary behavior. Okay, friends, Romans, countrymen. Exactly, Nathan. So this is the type of encoding where you have to pay attention and you have to make an effort. So as you start moving things into your memory, okay, learning brand new vocabulary terms that you've never learned before, you have to make new connections. Okay, memorizing historical events that you've never heard of before, you have to make new connections. That's all effortful. Episodic memory is a part of that as well, where it's you remembering episodes or events in your life. Does that make sense? Okay, so how do we know so much about memory and how to manipulate it? It's because as humans, we have meta memory, meaning we know that we have memory. We know that we remember things. We are aware that we remember some things and we forget other things. And then throughout generations, we've been able to test it, like with George Sperling with iconic memory or short-term memory or long-term memory. Okay, so we are able to make up these tips and tricks in order to take advantage of how our memory functions. Okay, now maintenance rehearsal, like we said before, is just you repeating information until it gets lodged in there. Okay, so many of you may have used index cards for this, like if you memorize the periodic table. Do y'all do that? Or y'all remember your nomenclature test in Miss Graben's class? Really easy, but people end up failing it anyway. Okay, that's just straight up, it's just straight up memorization. It's like, what is the name of this, what's the name for H2O? You're like, okay, water, bet, move on. Okay, just straight up memorization. Elaborate rehearsal is when you add in meaning. So oftentimes when I give real life examples of what's going on with world events and tie it to world history, or psychology is really good for that. Tying in the whole, the cheetah meme with I'm going to fly to Kentucky for reasons. So now y'all may remember that with implicit memory, okay? The whole interrogation style. So by making meaningful connections, it helps lodge it in your memory more effectively because there's already neural connections that you're just hijacking and using for your benefit. Does anyone need this slide?